Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I'm really thrilled to be joined this week by a fellow debutante writing author. We've got books that are kind of around the same subject, but a little bit of different take from each of us. So it's going to be really a lot of fun to have a chat. I'm joined by Georgie Blalock this week, talking about The Last Debutantes. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I really loved this book, partially because you got the best cover. And you
Oh,
also,
I
I don't
love
know
that
if you know
cover.
this, you got my title. This was the working title of my manuscript as well. But ironically, for some debutantes that came later, but I completely understand why this is the perfect title for this book. And we can maybe chat a little bit about the different eras of debutantes coming
Yes.
up. But perhaps the best place to start is talking about what people will find when they read The Last Debutantes.
So the Last Debutantes takes place in 1939, which is the last debutante season before World War II. And the book follows Valerie de Vere Cole, who is the niece of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. And so not only is she a debutante that year, but she's living in number 10 Downing Street. And Anne Chamberlain, Mr. Chamberlain's wife, is her aunt and is the one bringing her out. So she has this very unique perspective, not only on this last debutante season before the war, but also on the lead up to war and the politics that are kind of in play with it. But it's also an issue of that she, even though she has the lineage to be a debutante, her father was a wastrel and he died in a hovel in France, and he kind of dragged her down with him. So when he died, Anne Chamberlain brought her to England, brought her to number 10. And so Valerie is not only navigating this very uncertain time and the politics, but she's also navigating the social world that she really does not understand and hasn't been raised in and has to learn incredibly quickly. And so there's just a lot of conflict and a lot of really good character development and lots of meaty stuff to play with in that particular time period. Because the book only takes place from March 15th until right around July, the middle of July, with a little bit at the end of September with the beginning of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So
It is interesting because you get that compression of time with this book. And of course, as you can imagine, when you compress a whole bunch of events, because we can talk about what the London season was like during this time, it is an unrelenting, really grueling schedule. And it sounds strange to talk about parties being grueling, but I think
yes.
especially with a character who sort of is in this world but isn't in this world. She doesn't have all the language and all of the sort of mannerisms and the things that people would have grown up with and just known. She doesn't know the order of precedence. She doesn't know how you're supposed to necessarily address different people, what you should and shouldn't say, and that gets her into trouble
It
sometimes.
does,
So
yes.
can you talk a little bit about that sort of outsider looking in?
So the thing about society was that they all knew each other and they all understood how things worked, and they all understood, what family situation was what, and the way you're supposed to address certain people, and the way you're supposed to behave, and the way you're supposed to do all these things. And Valerie doesn't understand all these things. So she has to learn very quickly, who are the people you kind of avoid, who are the people you got to tiptoe around, what's the proper thing I have to say to this person or that person. Um, and then with the way I set it up in the book as well is that with the debutante season, what a lot of times they did beforehand is for debutantes, for the young women coming out, they were incredibly sheltered up until that moment. They
Mm-hmm.
grew up on the family estates. They didn't go to school like their brothers. This was their really first time out in the world, and they had to learn very quickly. So a lot of times what the mothers would do, especially pre-war, is they would start getting together in the late winter, early spring, and they would have these luncheons, and they would actually sit down with their planners and say, okay, I want to have my debutante ball this night. Okay, you would have yours this night, so that there weren't too many conflicts.
Yes.
And it gave the girls a chance to get to know each other. So the way I set it up in the book is that Valerie is sick and she misses that as well. So she's really coming into this situation cold. And on top of that, she's not in a position where she can, because a lot of times debutantes, even if they couldn't afford to do the season, they could do a presentation. So there
Mm-hmm.
was one story in my research about a girl who, she had a little bit of money. The family didn't have enough for her to do the season, but between her grandmother who lived in London and could loan her a car and the three required ostrich feathers and a dress and the train ticket to London, she actually was able to do a court presentation. And after it was over, she just went home. And that was something that could be done. But for Valerie, because she is the prime minister's niece and she's in this very prominent position, she can't just come and do that and then disappear. It just wouldn't look right. And so she kind of has no choice but to stay and to learn everything and to learn it very quickly.
Yeah, she is in this strange disadvantage, but she's also the character that you've written here, and there's a reason why I'm saying the character that you've written, and we can talk about that in a moment. But she really is, at the same time, I think she gains a lot by not having that training, by not sort of necessarily fitting in exactly with these other women. And it's interesting, you know, you have scenes where you very quickly realize that something is strange about this entire setup. It's such a foreign concept. Well, it's a foreign concept probably to Americans.
Right. Yes.
The London season of 1939. But you know, everybody would have known each other. Everybody would have grown up around each other, or at least been exposed to each other. Some of these girls go to finishing schools and things like that. And so it's just interesting. Everybody seems to have this pre-knowledge, and then they're launched into society and expected to find a husband. Yeah, exactly. And that's the real point of the season, right? Is to meet these people, but really to find somebody who's eligible, which seems so Victorian to us, I think.
It does. But one of the interesting things I found during my research was also that part of the season was also to train these young ladies how to function in society, so that whatever the future role was, that they would have the skills to be able to talk to a wide variety of people. They would have the stamina to be able to attend multiple events and to be gracious and that all through that. And that it was also, in a way, just a training ground for that, because some of these women went on to be politicians' wives or ambassadors' wives, where you're dealing with a whole bunch of different people and you have to be able to navigate those that are friendly, those that aren't, to be able to do it graciously. And so it was an interesting training ground as well. And what's interesting, especially about that 1939 season, is that many of those debutantes then go on to do war work. They work in factories. They join some of the women's auxiliary military services. And so a lot of that training that they received during the season, which is stamina, because, you know, you'd start your dinners, you start getting ready at 5 at night, and you wouldn't get home till 4 in the morning, and you did that night after night after night after night. So you learned how to do stamina, and then learning how to deal with a whole bunch of different people. These young ladies who joined these services and went to factory work were suddenly taken out of their very strict social group and forced to interact with various people and to do things they would have never thought they could have done. And so that training that they received during that 39 season, especially for this group, really did help them when it came to World War II.
Yeah. What do you think it is about that 39 season that is such a unique thing that keeps pulling us back? I have on my shelf actually Anne de Courcy's book, which I assume that you read for this, which I think is called The Last Season, and it's all about sort of the last great season before the war, of course, changed everything. But there seems to be this fascination with this moment in time around these women. What do you think that is that keeps pulling us to them?
There's a great documentary on YouTube. If you just type in debutantes, sometimes you debutante 1939, it comes up. And a lot of the people that are in the book appear in that documentary. And one of the things they talk about a lot, and I think the people in Anne de Courcy's book talk about it as well, is that everyone at that time sensed that the world was about to change. There's just that there was a hyper awareness of it. And so I think part of wanting to be interested in 1939 is you're sort of looking back maybe through rose-colored glasses a little bit at that particular era, and how that was the last hurrah of a certain innocence and a certain way of life that World War II would change forever. And so and people do mention, you know, the question is, were they during all these balls thinking this really is the last time this is all going to be like that? Or is that something that they applied later on, looking back on it? But I think because it was that last bit of normalcy and innocence and sort of that world of, I almost want to say that world of Downton Abbey, even though it had faded a great deal since, you know, World War I, it did still exist. And World War II pretty much killed it off entirely. So I think it's that sense, it's that last hurrah before the world changes.
I think, you know, you get at this through several moments in the book, and I'm always talking about not wanting to give spoilers. It makes it very difficult sometimes to talk about specific moments, but that's okay. So, you know, you do have a male character sort of having a moment of looking around a ball and just saying, kind of, what is even the point of this? Is this even going to exist? And the answer in some ways is no. It certainly didn't exist in the way that it had in 1939 my book is set in 1958. So
okay, yeah. Oh, that's definitely the last
that's literally the last time that debutantes were presented at court.
Yeah.
It was so interesting to me to get to read your book, and to, especially having written The Last Dance of the Debutante, which is my book, and really look at the things that had changed. Some of the grand balls in 1958 didn't exist anymore. Some of the chaperoning tradition and sort of very Victorian feeling things really had loosened by that point in time. But this really feels like that vestige of old elite high society England, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I think for the men too, because one of the things that I do in the book, like I said, without giving away too many spoilers, but one of the things I do in the book is you see that gradual shift from everyone's wearing the tuxedos to now all the young men are wearing uniforms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think especially for the male characters, they understand how much danger they're really going to be in pretty soon. So when they're dancing, it's like, enjoy yourself while you can, but it does seem a little silly in the face of, I might die on a battlefield pretty soon. Because for these characters, World War I was not that far away. Now, they wouldn't have been born at that time. They would have been born right after the war. But they would have had enough, I think, collective society memory to know just how devastating it was. Their parents knew. They all lived through it. And there is one scene in the book where they talk about how after World War I, the number of young men that died in Europe meant that there was a whole generation of women who could not find husbands because they had all died. And so these girls were aware of that's how how the world changed then. And so I think they are aware that things are going to change, and it's going to be very tragic that a lot of these gentlemen that they're dancing with night after night at these balls are going to die.
No, it really is. And it gives it a real sense of foreboding, as you get, of course, within this story, moments at 10 Downing Street, and because your character was the debutante in number 10, I imagine there was a lot of press interest in her and various other things going on. Well, there's also this incredible spotlight on her uncle as well. Can you talk a little bit?
With the book, I'm sorry. One of the things I did with the book is, in reality, Valerie actually lived with the Chamberlains a lot longer. Her dad died in 1936, and that was when Neville Chamberlain was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Mm-hmm. And so she was actually there for a lot longer. And so she had originally been there through the whole, peace in our time and that sort of stuff. For the book, I have her come to them much later so that you get that sense of the shock of being dropped into that world. But yes, she does get to see firsthand the politics, and things like that. But in this book, that takes a bit of a back seat because it is more the women's story and Anne Chamberlain and her involvement with Valerie. But it is something that's there and they're aware of. And there is a part in the book where Valerie does use her status as the prime minister's niece to work on some not political stuff, but some humanitarian efforts. Mm-hmm. And that's a privilege that not every debutante would have had.
Yes, I imagine. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about Aunt Anne, who is a sort of real lovely, calming, but very firm figure throughout this book. She's a person who we know quite a bit about, I would imagine. She's been written about before, unlike Valerie, who, of course, you talk about in your acknowledgements. It's sort of sketchy detail at best.
Very sketchy.
So can you talk a little bit about writing about a character like Anne Chamberlain, who we do know quite a bit about, and then maybe contrast that with writing about somebody who we really just have a few press clippings about?
Anne was interesting because there's actually a very big age difference between her and Neville Chamberlain. I think it's like 20 years. She was in her mid-20s. He was in his mid-40s. They didn't have a title, but they came from a family that had a manor house and had a long lineage that was related to the Earls of Oxford. And so she was very much a part of that world and understood it. But one of the things that in researching her is that Neville Chamberlain, his family had also been incredibly involved with politics. And him becoming prime minister is something that his father and half-brother never accomplished. So he rose higher than even they did. But he always attributed his success to Anne. And he was also a very, quite the family man. He would stop working at 7 o'clock every night to go be with his family because they also had 2 kids. But Anne is, to me, she came across through the research very much as I portrayed her, is this very strong woman who maybe didn't always give off that vibe to people, because there's a lot of people that when they referred to her in public, some of the snipier kind of society people would call her a powder puff. But she actually had a will of steel, and that she was able to step in and take care of Valerie when it was required, that she was able to move from being very minor landed gentry to the wife of the prime minister and everything that came with that, and that she was very graceful and very able to host parties and do things in Downing Street and to really help encourage his career. So with her, there was a good amount available in regards to research, including, I think it was her sister who had written a memoir of their childhood and things like that. And then there was family correspondence. With Valerie, the 39 season is she pops up because the Chamberlains, and she's a debutante. She shows up in some newspaper articles. Into the war, she kind of shows up in a couple, and then she vanishes very quickly. And there isn't a lot out there on her. She doesn't write a memoir. She doesn't write an autobiography. There's no biographies on her. And so that was great because it gave me a chance to create her as my own character. Mm-hmm. But it's tough because when you need inspiration or details, they're few and far between. And so what I did is I would look at people who were very similar to her. So like Lady Mountbatten, Clementine Churchill, they had these upbringings that were where they had the lineage to be in society, but they were dealing with some issues of poverty, neglect, and things like that. And so I would look to them to get a sense of, well, how did they navigate that eventually down the road? And so it was fun to include what details I could about Valerie. So like there's a scene where they go to the movie premiere. That did happen. Mm-hmm. Her coming out. If you go on my website, GeorgieBlalock.com, I have a whole page on the last debutantes, and there's a picture of Valerie and the Chamberlains on the night of her presentation. So there's all that kind of fun stuff that I could bring in. But then I had an incredible amount of leeway to make her my own and kind of do with her what I wanted to.
I think it's so interesting because, you know, often I'll speak to people where there is a historical record, or even while I'm reading the book, I can kind of cheat and go on Wikipedia and be like, I feel like I know something about this person, and I'll read and I'll go, oh, right. And then kind of look for it, which is a really bad habit that I need to stop. But I did that with her, and I realized there's almost nothing available about her.
Yes.
There must be an archive somewhere in the world that some historian is going to find and, you know, dig up at some point, because it just seems incredible that a woman who was in some ways in the middle of quite a lot of very significant history is so little known.
I think part of it is that Neville Chamberlain dies in, I believe, April of 1940. Mm-hmm. And when you're the guy that is before Winston Churchill and the events of World War II, I mean, he's incredibly, in a lot of ways, forgotten. Where when I would tell people she was the prime minister's niece, you know, I talked to people about it and they'd like, who? They didn't really know who Neville Chamberlain was. If I said Peace in Our Time, they kind of knew who he was, but not even then sometimes. So I think the fact that he passed away and then, you know, you have Winston Churchill, I think that whole period of time before that often gets overlooked. And I think she's part of that. And I also get the feeling that she probably did not want that limelight either.
I imagine it was an incredible amount of pressure.
I think so. And I think she saw, because her stepmother in the book, Mavis Wheeler, I think she's a real character, and all the things I talk about in the book happen, maybe not at the time I say them in the book, but they do happen. And I think she kind of saw how she got shoved into the spotlight in a very negative way because of her behavior and the damage that could do. Because one of the things about society was things followed you forever. Yeah. Once things happened, they didn't go away. They followed you around forever. And I think that was something that she was aware of. And then having seen her father self-destruct, and the same thing is that people knew who he was, and so all his bad behavior followed him. So I think she was very aware of that if you're in the limelight, you're going to be stuck there, and it's going to be harsh. And, you know, I think she probably, because of that, she decided to fade. Because even in the Chamberlain correspondence that I was able to access, I think it's through the University of Birmingham, she rarely even shows up then. So.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I'm curious how you got the inspiration to write about her. If there is so little that's known about her, how did you stumble across her?
Well, I believe it's in the Anne de Courcy book. She does mention her a number of times. And as I was searching and wanting to do a story in this time period, she just seemed like the best choice because she had such an interesting situation. She wasn't just a debutante. She was a debutante coming out from number 10 during this pivotal moment in history. And she had quite a background that lent to a great deal of characterization and story and drama and conflict and all the things you look for when you want to put a story together. And she kind of came with it all. So that was where, because when I started reading about the Anne de Courcy stuff, I read her book and then read about Valerie. Same with you. I went and started doing the research and wow, there just isn't much. But what there is pointed to a lot to develop on and to kind of have fun with, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. How about researching the London season? So you've mentioned this Anne de Courcy book a couple of times, but what were some of the elements that you were drawing on as you built out this world? Because one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this time is it just doesn't exist in the way that it used to anymore. So it's not like you can just go to a debutante ball a la 1939.
Right. There's a lot for that. So one of the things I have is I have a British newspaper archive subscription. And one of the things is the newspapers follow that stuff like they were celebrities. The debutantes were celebrities. So there's tons of articles about what the debutantes are doing and wearing and things like that. There's a lot of books on the debutante season, not specifically 1939, but because it was something that lasted for so long, it kind of went away in World War II, but it comes back in the 20s. And it really kind of didn't change that much during that time. The only time it kind of changed is when the Duke of Windsor was king and he was not interested in doing it. So that year he had like a garden party and it was just a complete disaster. But as soon as he abdicates and the new king comes in, all the tradition comes back. And there were just so many famous people that went through that. The Mitford girls all went through the debutante season. And there are tons of biographies about them and some autobiographies. And they talk about that season. And in the book, I have Eunice Kennedy. Her father was the ambassador to England at that time. She did go through the 1939 season, but her sister Kit Kennedy had gone through in 1938. And so I would look at books about that and stories and articles and things about the Kennedys and their experience going through that season, especially for them because they were outsiders.
Again, that outsider element.
Yeah, the outsider
really helped.
And so because there were so many girls, and then like I said, there was the YouTube video that talked about it, which was great because the ladies in that give spectacular details about, what's happened. So it's just, and I think also kind of got lucky because one thing about writing in that time period is there's a lot of film reels, British Pathé. They have a ton of stuff all on YouTube and you can look at it. And then there's tons of news articles. And so because it was so heavily covered in the media as well, there's just a lot to draw on for that particular time period.
We actually have a question around that from Anissa. Since you both have to had books about debutantes, what did you find as the most interesting piece of research? Was there something that really jumped out at you if you take a step back and look at it as a whole?
I think for me, it was the idea that this was as well as the marriage market for these girls, this was also a training ground, as I spoke about earlier, that they were really expected to learn how to function in society and then go on and use these skills when they were married and depending on what their husband's line of work was and stuff. So that I thought was a little shocking because I always did think it was just like, you go, you find a husband, you're done. But the fact that it was meant to be more, because one of the things that one of the books talked about, I can't remember which book, is how their governesses would train these girls in snap conversation. So the one of the women talks about her governess would walk her through the garden and stop and pretend that a bush was somebody and say, okay, now talk to that person about the weather or talk to that person about horses or just quick. And that was one of the things they talk about with the girls, is that suddenly they're talking to these young men who they're dancing with. And these dances actually go on a lot longer than you realize. And so they have to spend a lot of time together. And so they would talk about how they would have to come up with topics of discussion. And, sometimes it's easy and sometimes it wasn't. And so one of the things they talk about, and I do mention this in the book, is they had what was called the alphabet game. So they would start at a subject that started with the letter A. And if that was a great conversation, that's spectacular. But if it didn't go very far, then you'd start with something on the letter B. And so it really taught them how to talk to people and how to interact with people. And I thought that was interesting.
I can't wait to see it on modern dating website advice columns.
Oh,
it's
right.
going to happen at some point.
It is, actually.
Were there specific details that for you really made that world come alive? Specific things that you wanted to put in the book to really convey this is a different time, this is something that feels different from now?
I think that the outfits and the clothing, that, which is fun, like I said before, everything being so well documented, it was great to be able to go and see, like the dress that Valerie wears to the Royal Academy art opening is one she actually wore. And to be able to describe that, and just also a lot of the small habits like gloves and purses and all those little things and hats and things like that we don't have anymore, but we're aware of. Mm-hmm. But we always look back at that time and think, well, that's very much in the past. Right. And so it was fun to bring a lot of that in, especially like the glamour that everybody's wearing, the long evening dresses and the champagne and of course the smoking, because if you've ever watched an old movie, they all smoke like chimneys. So
absolutely.
So you can't ignore that fact. And then also some of the differences with the girls, that what was expected of them at the time as opposed to nowadays. Because that's a topic in the book in a brief part, is that Eunice Kennedy, as an American girl, is expected to go home and go to university.
Right.
But these girls, if they said, hey, I want to go to university, everyone would have a good laugh about it and then move on to the next subject. And so that was another difference between back then and now. It kind of gives you that sense of that era.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was able to actually speak to some debutantes who did the 58 season, and then even though court presentations stopped in 58, you mentioned at the end of the book, when you're talking in your author's note, about how certain elements of the season continued on. So I spoke to two women who were friends in 64 and did the season. And one of them mentioned the fact that she had a place at Trinity in Dublin, and she was told, no, you're not going to go to university. You're going to go and you're going to do the season. And it was really important to her family, very important to her family. And unfortunately, there was a family tragedy and she didn't end up doing the full season. And so, one of the things that she expressed was that it's just such a different time and a different era. And you would never sort of make a girl, it wasn't even a choice really that she was forced to make. She was just told this is the expectation. And that was as late as 1964. It is a very, very different world, I think, especially for the women of that class. And I think this is very much a class specific.
Very much, yes.
Yeah, it really feels distant from us.
Well, all the mothers had done it. And so I think a lot of them were like, well, I remember how exciting my season was, so it's time for your season. And then all of them, any girl that had an older sister, the older sister had done it.
Yeah.
And I think for the younger girls watching this too, this is that one moment in the first time that they're the center of attention, that they really get to shine. They're taken to London. They get a whole new wardrobe. All the men are trying to get signed on their dance cards. So I think there's a certain level of attention that they had never experienced really before, that they suddenly get to enjoy, and that's desirable.
Yeah. And I imagine for some girls, it would have been wonderful. And for some girls, it must have been absolutely terrifying.
Yes. I think that's something Anna Corsi talks about in a lot of the books. And it's in that YouTube documentary as well. They talk about it, that yes, all of a sudden, if you're a shy girl or you're a little awkward or anything that just makes you uncertain, which, these girls are all 18. I mean, who of us at 18 wasn't a little awkward and unsure, right? So to suddenly be thrust out in the limelight, to be expected to perform, to be out in society and dealing with, the backstabbing, the good and the bad, that must have been just awful. So, and I think it's one of these things that like some girls figured out how to work with that and to overcome that, and some did not. And that's one of the themes in the book, is to be able to kind of rise to the occasion, to find that strength within you to meet the challenges that you're being faced with, whether it's the season of war or your background or whatever. And so I think that's one of the things that was involved in the season, is just how do you meet this challenge and what kind of person are you at the end of it?
Yeah, and I think that has a lot more weight than some people sometimes ascribe to
Right.
frivolous things like being a
Right,
debutante. But for
exactly.
these women, it was incredibly serious. And it
It
for this
was.
group of people in society, no matter what we think about it, it really was a make or break situation. And you have debutantes sort of behaving badly, or people around debutantes behaving badly in this book. And you see the impact of that on these girls.
Because like, once again, when you're in society and you're in society's eye, if you do a misstep, it could potentially, depending on how big it is, follow you and define you for the rest of, well, what they considered forever. I think the reality is World War II came in and created enough interruptions that a lot of stuff was forgotten, because, one of the debutantes I talk about, she is Pamela Digby. And, amazingly, for how she behaved, she was in the 38th season, for how she behaved, that she eventually became Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law and stuff, I think kind of gives you an idea of how much World War II changed things.
Yeah, Pamela sounded like a good party, a lot of fun, but
Yeah,
maybe not behaving the way people expected her to.
No, she was not. And that was another interesting thing about the book, or about doing research, is that you look back, not so much the debutantes, because I think there were debutantes that were misbehaving, but it was kept so much on the down low that those stories kind of don't percolate through. But when you look at their parents and what they were up to, it's shocking. Like, we think of them all as the prim and proper Downton Abbey, and really they weren't. Not all of them, but there was a big group that was doing things like, when you read the book and you read about Mavis and the painting, that you can go on Google and find that painting. That does exist, or the pencil sketch. And if you go read about her, the man who became her husband, Wheeler, oh my goodness, shocking.
No, it's true. And you realize that in a lot of cases, once you produced a child, so long as you were discreet, you could go off and have an affair, so long as you were discreet.
As long as you were discreet. And discreet was even, as long as people were just whispering about what you were doing.
Right.
Once it became in the paper or very loud, it was game over. But if people were just kind of whispering, because part of it too, everybody kind of knew what was going on. Nobody was fooling anybody.
No, they weren't. And so it is interesting when you have characters who decide to sort of take a stand against that, or to stand up against other people's behavior and sort of apply. I don't think it's modern ideals. I just think it's a different moral code maybe than some people were operating with. And that's where you have outsider characters who sort of help shine a bit of a light on that, I think.
But that's also part of learning those rules of society, that I think when I used to write Regency romances, the comment is that it was not polite to remark on who the younger children resembled.
Yes.
Because the first two kids were by the husband, and the last two may not be. But as a married couple, they were considered to be his, even if everybody knew they weren't. And so you were not supposed to say, like, hey, you look like your dad, because dad may not have been dad. So, and that was one of those unspoken rules that everybody kind of knew to follow.
You just didn't do it. It was best left unsaid.
Exactly.
So we've got a question, which I think is a great one here. And maybe we can do a little bit of service journalism here. So Gail asks, can you explain what the season involved?
Oh, okay.
Now the season is complex, so maybe we'll do an overview.
I'll do an overview.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it was the debutante season. So a girl who was 18 or 19, it was her coming out. It would be her presentation into society, to basically say, I am now an adult. You weren't a full adult till you got married, but that I am now available to be married, that you're going to see me now. I'm out of the schoolroom. I'm out from underneath the governess, and I'm here. And so it started with the court presentation. Now, it didn't always start for everybody with the court presentation, because there were, I think, 4 of them that year, and including one that was in July. But for Valerie, her court presentation was March 15th of 39. So they would go and they would be presented to the king and queen, and they would dress specifically, and they would go and they would bow to them. And then what would happen is there would be about a 4-month round of parties and balls. So every girl that was presented to the king and queen, who was a debutante, would have her coming out ball. So it would be a ball either thrown in the family's house, or there were places you could rent, or at a hotel. And every single night there would be tons of these balls happening throughout London. And then on top of that would be other activities. So there would be things like movie premieres, Ascot, other horse racing events. It was basically just a whirl of social luncheons, dinners, philanthropy stuff. One of the big things, this comes up in the book, is it was the Queen Charlotte's birthday ball.
So this is my favorite event of
Yeah.
all the events because it's
And this is something that
mad.
went on for quite some time. And so what would happen is Queen Charlotte was the wife of George III, and she had started a maternity hospital. And so the Queen Charlotte's birthday ball was a ball to raise money for this maternity hospital. But it also became the premier debutante event. And it's such an odd kind of tradition, because what they would do is there was a big birthday cake they would have. And the birthday cake represented Queen Charlotte. So all the debutantes would bow to the birthday cake, which sounds so odd.
Strangest thing.
But that's what they did. And so the season was just that round of parties and balls and events that marked a woman's entry into society and said that she's both ready to be married, and even if she didn't get married, that she's not a schoolgirl anymore.
Right.
And so it was a rite of passage.
Right. And it's interesting too. So one of the things that I found with my research was certain things have weight to them. So Queen Charlotte's Ball has a lot of weight to it. It's a huge event. You know, your family would be there, and then you'd serve the family cake. Yes. You guys can actually go on and see footage of Queen Charlotte's Ball. It's the strangest thing. They sort of descend these staircases, and then there's this sort of choreographed thing, and then there's a cake, and they all curtsy to the cake. It's very weird, but it was a staple of the season into the 70s, I think it was.
Oh yeah, it lasted longer than anything else, because once the court presentations, ended in 58, people who still wanted to do the season needed something to kind of rally around, and that became the thing.
Yeah, and they all wore white.
Yeah, it's just a really interesting kind of, but that's an old tradition. It had gone, I can't remember when exactly it started, but because I don't think it started when
I think it
Queen
lasted
Charlotte
about 200 years. It went
on for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then of course you have the part of what I did a little bit of research on was what happened when things weren't in London, because some people had country houses, so you would at least in 58 they would throw you on a train, and these really kind of naive, in some cases, girls who hadn't really been exposed to the world would just get on a train at Victoria or Paddington or wherever, and they'd be picked up at the other side and housed with somebody, and they'd go to these balls and wherever in the countryside. And then there's different elements. So in 58 you had the Dublin Horse Show, so you did the Irish balls and you had the Scottish balls in September, and it did sort of just continue through its own momentum, I think, for months. And this was your life. I don't know if we can kind of emphasize to people how packed these women's schedules were.
Oh yeah, they were crazy. It was just, it is hard to kind of suggest, but because a dinner would start at like 8, and the ball itself wouldn't start till 10 or 11, and it would go until 4 o'clock in the morning. And then if you lived in a household, a lot of times the parents were like, look, the servants are putting the breakfast on the table at 9. You need to be up because we're not saving breakfast for you. And then the girls would go to have lunch with each other, or they'd go to some charity event. And then, on top of also having to do, hair and makeup and things like that. I mean, it was quite the rigorous schedule. Imagine if you were getting ready for prom for 4 months straight.
Right. And you just had a whole bunch, and in some cases, multiple proms on the same night. It's just amazing.
It's crazy.
It is. And I've heard it described as a marathon, and I think that's really true. And then of course, not only do you have to have sort of the time to do this, so you couldn't be working, you also had to have the means, and it was incredibly expensive to bring these girls out.
It was, though it could be done on a budget. That was another interesting thing in the research, because at this point you had department stores.
Yeah.
And so if you go and you look back in the old newspapers, there's ads for court presentations gowns from like Selfridges. So there's a lot of off the rack stuff that girls could get. And if girls were resourceful, they could borrow things like the one I was talking about with the grandmother, where her grandmother had the required stuff. And so she was able to do it, but that was all she was able to do. She did not have the money for the rest of it. And so, it was incredibly expensive. One of the characters in the book, and this is based on real life, is a Christian Grant. She had been left money by a governess, and that was how she paid for her season. And one of the things she did is to keep her debutante ball expenses down, she shared the ball with another girl so they could split the expenses. So they would also, so those who did not have the means could become very creative about how it is they were able to do the season. You could do it as cheaply as you wanted, or you could, spend as much as you wanted. But yeah, it was just an interesting, as long as you had the lineage to get in.
Well, and that's the thing, right? You had to be presented by a woman who herself had been presented, and you needed to have an invitation. And so it was very selective. I mean, even
It
if you
was.
don't have the money, some of these girls, again, would have been presented and not necessarily done the rest of the things, right?
And I think what I remember in my research too is for girls who couldn't get to London, I think there was a presentation in Scotland.
I think there's a Balmoral presentation in 58 as
Yeah.
well for the sort of Scottish, the
Yes.
Scottish peerage.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It kind of sweeps up a whole bunch of people. But then, people who do the full thing, that is a very specific, and you have to be in London too, which even in
You
that
do,
day and
yes.
age is more expensive than the rest of the country. So
It's also something that was so craved that anybody who was new money and came to London, if they wanted their daughters brought out, there were ladies, matrons, who had titles, who would, for a fee, bring your daughter out. And there were 2 or 3 of them, and they would advertise in the newspaper. And if you wrote that check, and she would present your daughter, and then she would help get her into all the parties and things like that.
mhm.
And so that was a lot of times how new money would get their daughters married into the aristocracy, is by putting them there, where the sons of all the nobles are, which is all these parties and stuff like that. But they paid for that. They paid a lot for that.
Yeah. Yeah, you really pay for the privilege of having your daughter presented. But of course, to some people, that was the ultimate sign of
Yes, it
acceptance
was.
into society, even if society didn't always accept you after that. So
Right. But that's also, if you look at Downton Abbey, the Lady Cora, she came with that American money and got herself a title. And so there was a lot of that too, because after World War I, a lot of the aristocratic families were very short on funds and were
yes.
willing to trade that title for the American money inheritance.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Gail asks, would they need multiple white gowns for each separate party?
No, the white gown was only for the court presentation. You could then wear it again if you wanted to, but for the parties, you just had to wear formal attire. And so, if all you had was one dress, you could actually do it, but most didn't. And you had your choice. You could either have your dresses custom made, or you could buy them off the rack.
When I was doing research, I found a lot of girls going to places like Worth to have their presentation,
Yes.
or to have their coming out party dress made.
Right, right.
And in 58, the rules are they did go back to the garden party as opposed to the evening presentation. So it's not quite as grand. You have the silk day dress, and there were very specific things that you needed to wear, but it wasn't as elaborate with the
Right.
train and the ostrich
The
feathers.
feathers and yeah.
Exactly. So, different things start to change. And, but my understanding was most girls would have had 2 or 3 long dresses that they
Yes.
would rotate through. One would be a white dress so that you could, in 58 at least, so that you could do Queen
Yeah.
Charlotte's ball.
In 39, they would have the white dress and they would wear that. And then, yeah, for everything else, they would just have a selection of dresses that they would wear. And, like I said, everything from they would have a seamstress make them up to, I think I remember reading something about there was a bargain basement in one of the department stores. And if a girl didn't have a lot of money, but she was willing to go down there and dig, she could, outfit herself
Yeah.
pretty well there.
But it's not just the dresses, right? It's the gloves and the hats
Right.
and the handbags and the shoes and
Stockings.
the manicurist and the so many stockings.
Hairstylist. Oh yeah, I mean there was a whole thing that went with it as well. Yes, you had the hairdresser, manicurist, stockings, gloves, purses, hats. There was a lot, and so a lot was required.
Yeah, it really does sort of show you how much it's changed. So we've had this question a couple of times. Is the ultimate goal of the season to end up with a marriage proposal? And I think my answer to that would be depends on your family and depends on the era that you're in.
Yeah, I think it really depends on your family. The higher ranking your parents are, the more pressure there's going to be to make a very good match. So for that, the more landed gentry with a nice lineage, probably not quite as much. In Anne de Courcy's book, she does talk about there were some girls, they had the lineage, but they weren't real high up there. And so one girl was training as a nurse. And so she would, during the day, she would be in nursing school, and at night she would actually drive down to London to attend all the balls and parties.
That's madness.
It's crazy. And also, I think I talk about this in the book, is that there's this place called the Monkey School, And the reason it's called that is because on the building, there's the hear no evil, see no evil monkeys. And that school, the whole point of it is that women of good breeding, I guess is the best way to say it, you know, families and stuff could go there, and you had a choice of what you could learn. You could either learn things like etiquette, or you could actually learn secretarial skills. You could learn things that you could then turn into workings. But again, that all depends on your rank. The lower down you are, the less likely you're going to be doing that. But there were some very noticeable people that went to that school. One of the Mitford girls went. I think it was Diana. I mentioned the book. It was a Princess Bagratan, I might be saying that name wrong, who went on to marry the Maharaja of Jaipur, and I hope not murdering all that, but she actually attended the school. And so it had some very notable people in it, but how much you were going to get a career out of it in the end really did depend on your rank.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question here from Andrea. Do debutantes do anything anymore, or is this a lost tradition?
I think it still exists. I think they kind of brought back the Queen Charlotte's Ball. And I don't know that much about it, but I think if you Google it, there's a couple of articles on it.
It's
but I think nowadays,
diminished.
Pardon?
It's very diminished from what it used to be.
It's very diminished, and there is, my understanding, and you would know this better than me, is that there still is a London season as far as like Ascot and some events, but it's not quite the thing it used to be. And my understanding is that if you do something like the Queen Charlotte's Ball, that one coming out ball is it. You do that, it's fun, and then you're pretty much done at that point. That there isn't a whole full season of events like there used to be.
Yeah, I think there are certain very high profile things. So for instance, getting into the Royal Enclosure in Ascot, going to Henley, there are certain things where you'll see sort of the people who pop up in Tatler, just still exists incredibly to this day. So there is kind of that socialite thing that happens in London, but it's not on the level that it used to be. It's not sort of organized in the way that it used to be. I know somebody who would probably kill me if I said her name out loud, so I won't, but she was the daughter of a debutante and was asked in the 1980s whether she wanted to be a debutante, because there was a push to try to revive some of the great old things, and she just had no interest in all. I think she was like hanging out in combat boots with paint in her hair, very much wanted to be an artist type of thing. So she had no interest at all. So it really, when you see things open up for women societally in the 1960s, 1970s, you really see a lot of this start to fade. And I think it's seen as being very traditional and very staid and kind of not, I mean, when the point of some of it, at least, is to meet a husband and meet the right sort of people, it becomes less and less relevant, I think, to girls' lives as women's lives overall across all classes are starting to really change. Yeah, it's a funny one to look back at, though. And then of course there are debutantes in the United States as well. So I don't know if you've gotten asked about this, but were you a debutante yourself? No, me neither.
No. And my understanding is those, I mean, my knowledge of that is very limited, but I think it's more, if it was going to happen, it's more of an East Coast thing too, maybe in New York and DC.
I think some parts of the South it still exists as well.
Yeah, I think so, but my knowledge of that is pretty limited.
Yeah, I'm from Pasadena, as we talked about beforehand, in Southern California, and there is a very, very small debutante coming out, and I wanted to do it actually because I wanted the big dress and the party, but didn't tell anybody this, of course. And my mother realized this a couple, years after I would have been too old to do it. She said, "Well, we had a friend who would have sponsored you. She was a debutante, 70 whatever." And I thought, oh, that's a bit of a shame, but at the same time, it's not like this era that we're talking about now.
Right. Yes, not at all.
It's a different thing, and it's an American thing. And I do know people who were presented and all those things, and it sounds fascinating, but no, I sort of had a near miss with that one myself. So
yeah, no, I'm in Southern California too, and like I said, it's just, if it is a thing here, like you said, it's very small, and it's not something you would hear about.
Yeah, there certainly isn't the way that it was sort of nationally, everybody in this class would have known across the entire country and would have sort of come together and done this thing. That is very specific to
Britain. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would be very curious to know about what you're planning on doing post debutante. So I know obviously you're promoting this book and that takes, your time and attention and you want readers to read that, but what can they look forward to from you next?
Working on a book on Princess Louise, who was Queen Victoria's daughter, and she was a rebel for that era. She had her own art career, and she was just very different from all of her siblings. And so I'm working on a novel about her, and it follows her through her art career, and she had lovers and things like that. So I'm having a lot of fun with that.
I can
So
imagine.
England still, but a little bit farther back.
She's a fascinating figure, and she was around for a very long time as
She
well.
was,
She
I
saw a lot of
mentioned her.
change.
The Princess Louise, who's at the Queen Charlotte's Ball in The Last Debutantes, is that same Princess Louise. She lived until 1939.
She was an incredible figure. So her sculpture of Victoria is outside
That's right.
Kensington Gardens, and I used to
Right.
run by it all the time. And it's sort of incredible being able to see that because you don't associate a princess with having an
Right.
art career at all.
And she did, and she had quite a, and she was friends with Whistler and Millay and all these luminaries of the art world at that time. And so it's just fascinating who I'm getting to bring in, which is a lot of fun.
Oh, that sounds like a blast. I would love to also hear about what you are reading right now and recommending to people. We're always looking for to be read pile recommendations on this.
Well, right now I'm very deep in this nonfiction history because
I can imagine.
So I would recommend I believe the name of it, I don't have it with me, is Queen Victoria's Mysterious Daughter. And it's all about Princess Louise. And it's a very well written book that it's not dry. And it's fairly short, but it's a great book on Princess Louise and her time and how different she was compared to her siblings and her mother and the expectations of a princess in that era. So I would highly recommend that book. I'd love to say I'm a little deeper in fiction right now, but everything right now is pretty much nonfiction history.
That happens when you're sort of in
research
mode and you're writing and you just think, I just need to focus on this one thing.
Yes. Once everything's turned in, then suddenly I get to go crazy and things like that. But right now it's very much but I highly recommend that book.
Wonderful. Well, I would love to make sure that you get a chance to tell people where they can find the book and then also where they can find you online as well if they want to follow along.
My website is www.georgieblalock.com. And The Last Debutante is available now, and it's everywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Kobo, all those places. And so anywhere you get books, it's also available Kindle paperback, and there's a wonderful audiobook. The lady who did the other Windsor Girl narration did the narration for this one, and she's excellent.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I know people have been very excited about this and ready to dive into the world of the debutantes. So I'm sure this has been an absolute treat, and it's been a treat for me.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've enjoyed it. I always love talking about it.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have to have you come back and talk about Princess Louise. So
I'd love to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And guys, I'll see you next week. Enjoy your reading.
Thank you.